Welcome to the Alaska Report. I'm Senator Mark Begich. This show is designed to inform you about the issues, programs, and people important to Alaska. Today, my guests are two well-known Alaskans. Willie Hensley, lifelong Alaskan and respected Alaska Native leader. Willie is here today as the chairman of the Board of Trustees for the First Alaskans Institute. And Liz Medicine Crow, here today as the vice president of the Institute, as well as the director of the Alaska Native Policy Center. You guys have both long titles. Thank you both for being here today, and it will be an opportunity for us to share a little bit about what you are doing. But before we get going, Willie, I know in the last couple of weeks we lost a great American, someone who had impact to Alaska, and that was Stuart Udall. Maybe you had some experiences with Stuart, right?
Well, yes. I knew Secretary Udall. He was the first and youngest selection by President Kennedy for his cabinet. And Secretary Udall was the first person to have to deal with the question of essentially who owns Alaska. As you know, we had a huge conflict early on in statehood about native land claims. And without Secretary Udall's decision to kind of hold the line on disposition of lands until there was a resolution by Congress, we would have been in deep trouble. And he helped us get equity. Without his support in the land freeze, I don't believe we could have ever had a chance to get a piece of legislation through Congress that, in fact, your father helped with in 1971. So we owe a great debt of gratitude to Secretary Udall for his work.
Well, it's amazing when I think about today. I serve with his son and a nephew today in Congress. So it's interesting the generations that move forward. But I knew you had personal relationship, and I thought that was just important for our viewers to kind of understand that connection between Alaska Native land claims and Stuart Udall. Because I know, as you said, there's some times when the Udalls were not very popular in Alaska, but this piece was very important for where we are today.
That's right.
Let me, if I can, I know you're here to talk about a lot of great programs the Institute is doing, and there are many important programs we talk about on this program, but the First Alaskans Institute is working on, I think, some significant programs. And maybe, Liz, you could talk first about the census and the relationship that the Institute has in helping make sure the census this year comes off well and everyone is counted. Maybe you could talk a little about that.
Sure. Well, we have a really unique relationship with the U.S. Census Bureau. A few years ago, the Census Bureau designated the Alaska Native Policy Center at First Alaskans Institute as the Census Information Center for Alaska. And in that role, we have a very strong partnership with them and have worked to make sure that concerns and considerations are made and taken when they develop their program for outreach for the 2010 census. So we've been with them, been working with them to make sure that they're contacting tribal people in the villages, and they're working with communities, and they've been really great about that outreach. Excellent. And through the Policy Center, not only do we partner with them, but we also do our own studies and research about the census and its importance to Alaska Native people, about its impacts on our communities, and really trying to help make sure that all Alaska Natives and all Alaskans participate in the census by completing their forms and getting them mailed in.
Very good. How old is the Institute, Willie or Liz? How old is the First Alaskans Institute?
Well, you know, we formed the AFN in the mid-60s. And we had something called the AFN Foundation initially, and its main product was a textbook, really, that was edited by Bob Arnold. And I think in '89, we created the Institute as a, actually it was called the Alaska Native Foundation initially, as a separate entity.
As a kind of a standalone, its own operation.
That's right. And we have an endowment that came out of our relationship with the oil industry. As you might recall, we couldn't select lands along the right-of-way.
Right.
And they also had made some commitments to train and hire Native Alaskans during the pipeline, which they did very good during the construction phase, but after they forgot about it for about 15 years, and as a consequence, they worked out a resolution of the problem and endowed the what we now call the Institute. And so it is basically a Native think tank. It's designed to work on issues that are important to our community, to analyze and research and try to look into the future a bit, to work on issues that impact our people.
And you do some leadership development or training. I'm not sure what the right phrase is these days anymore, but it's basically growing young leaders into successful leaders. And maybe Liz or Willie, if you want to, Liz, maybe comment about what's kind of your outreach and what do you do in the institute?
What are we doing?
Yeah, I know.
Right.
At times I've spoken to some of the groups, and it's great to talk to them. But maybe you could tell about the leadership development that you do within the Native community.
Right, so there's actually two kind of main initiatives that First Alaskans focuses on. One is the Alaska Native Policy Center, which is the Native think tank that Willie was just talking about. And the others
That's
are...
where all the great ideas come from.
Yeah.
And then you got to now produce leaders to make them happen.
And that's our leadership development initiative.
Right.
And through that initiative, we have a summer intern program. Right now we're actually really recruiting employers across Alaska, in villages, in the hubs, in the cities, if they're interested in
What kind of areas do you look for?
whichever areas that they have a position.
Oh, so
for
it's
to
wide
direct.
open.
It's wide open, because what
Okay.
we try to do is match our interns with their study area into the field of work
Gotcha.
that
So
an
if
employer
they're
might
studying
offer.
maybe being an engineer, you're going to look for some of these companies that have opportunity for them to do some work in
Exactly.
maybe short periods or long periods. What's
We
kind
have
of
a 10-week program in the summer. They come to us in Anchorage for a week where they get to meet their cohort, and there's usually about 20 or 30 people who participate. And these are juniors and seniors and graduate students in college. They come to Anchorage where they meet each other, they start learning about Alaska history, Alaska Native history, and then they move into their workplaces. We've had people in Metlakatla, in Hoona, in Anchorage, all over different types of professions.
And who's eligible again? What's the range that you kind of focus on age-wise?
Age-wise, it's not the age, it's their placement in college. So
Okay.
juniors and seniors in college and graduate students are eligible.
And do you have deadlines throughout the year, or is there a specific time and that's it, and then?
Yeah, the deadline actually passed for the interns for
Okay.
this year.
For this year, the school year.
And usually the deadline is at the end of January or early February for the interns themselves. And right now, like I said, we're recruiting the employers
Very good.
for the matching between the jobs and the interns.
And now I want to get back to internship, but I also know in the policy end you have, is it fellows, policy fellows? How does
Yes.
that work? And maybe Willie, you could, or Liz, kind of talk
ahead.
about that. Liz?
So we have, right now we have 5 public policy fellows down in Juneau who work with state legislators.
That has to be an experience.
It is, it's a great experience, and I think on both sides.
Does Willie, I know he's former state legislator, do you give a little role modeling once in a while?
Well,
Do you
I'll
have
tell
to
you what,
like do a little practice before they go down?
If we only had them when I was in the legislature.
Actually, back then it was 3 to a room and 1 staff, right?
That's right. Well, we did all the work at our desk, really.
That's right.
We didn't have any staff.
So the fellows go down during the session
Yep.
then?
They're hosted by an office. The program, the Fellows Program, went through the Legislative Ethics Committee, and we're one of 2 that can place fellows in offices in Juneau. And so we have these high caliber Alaska Natives who are not just answering phones or making copies, but they're actually carrying bills and they're working for their legislator as a staff person,
So
a member
real
of their
policy
team.
development.
Yep.
So it's a real experience.
Very real experience. And we have 5 amazing people. It was, we're in our 4th year with the program. It started with 1 or 2, and now we're up to 5, and we're hoping to continue to increase the program, increase the funding for the program, and start placing people all over, because it's an experience for the fellows, especially seeing how law is made in Alaska and the policy implications, but also to have that visibility of these young, wonderful Alaska Native people working really hard.
And when you recruit, for example, for the policy fellows, do you, how do you do that? Is it word of mouth? Is it, you know, to reach out so it's not just urban Alaska Natives, but it's villages and rural Alaska? How do you reach out to that? What's the process?
We spread it throughout all of our contacts, all of our networks.
To the regions and the villages and the IRAs and everything.
Yep.
So.
And we just do, what is it called, viral emails?
Viral
where you just
email.
ask your friends to spread it
I mean,
and let
they
it go
say,
forward.
I know all about those being in the Senate now. One thing can lead to so many.
Yes.
But that's, so you do that through, so you're using
We
the
do.
internet and the
We have
contact?
Facebook accounts.
Oh, you too?
Yeah, we Twitter.
Oh, excellent. Well, this
But
is
we
great.
also make phone calls, and we talk to our leadership. We let them know what's happening. We ask them to get the word out in their e-newsletters and their printed newsletters. So,
Do you think, Willie, I mean, you said it a little bit earlier about if you wish you had these when you were in the legislature, these fellows. What do you think of, from a former legislator standpoint, these fellows are, are about? And are they truly potential future elected officials, policymakers? What's your sense?
Well, it really is amazing. I mean, we have had really a generation of young people who have had tremendous opportunities to attend colleges, universities across the country, and also to gain experiences abroad that many of us didn't have that opportunity in our youth. And so they're very talented, and of course we wouldn't be doing our duty if we didn't have some connection to that generation who will be carrying the load, you know, down the road, dealing with all the many issues that confront us in Alaska. And so the experience of, you know, working in a policy role to see how, you know, the system works is very invaluable. And in fact, you know, we're doing it to some extent here in the DC area as well. Right. And to us, that is absolutely essential to know how the system functions, how you might be able to affect it. And most of us, we got into it sort of out of pure necessity and having no other options to really try to change public policy. And so this way they have a chance to at least have the skills, you know, that we didn't have when we started. You know,
it's funny you mentioned that, and that's exactly, as you were describing this, I was thinking back in some, you know, the book you've written, other books I've written about the naval land claims days, and prior to that you had to learn on the job, literally.
Oh, absolutely.
As you're trying to move massive federal legislation. And the skills of what now the young people have by going through this policy, that they are going to be able to help their communities, their cities, their villages on policy issues because they understand the process, which is probably 3/4 of the battle.
That's right.
I mean, I've learned that here, that if you don't know the process, you're never going to get through it.
That's right, and we know we had some sort of bitter experiences in a way because on occasion we didn't really quite know what we were doing, and we didn't have any experience in lobbying, we didn't have any experience in media and PR, you know, but we had to try to move a country, right? And thank goodness, I think we had a little guardian angel kind of watching over us, and it helped when we had an excess of passion, but we didn't have a lot of the details and the understanding of the system and the process.
That's right. Well, let me do this. We're going to take a short break now. When we return, more about First Alaskans Institute and the work in Alaska, and we'll be right back. This is Senator Mark Begich. The 2010 census begins right here in Alaska. Federal funds for Alaska depend on the census, so it is vital for everyone to be counted. Complete and return the form from your mailbox. Learn more at 2010census.gov. Welcome back. I'm Senator Mark Begich, and this is Alaska Report. I'm talking to Willie Hensley, the chairman of the board of the First Alaskans Institute, with Liz Medicine Crow, vice president of the organization, as well as the director of the Alaska Native Policy Center. We had some great discussion a little bit ago, and I'd like to continue that. And I know one of the issues, and we're obviously dealing with it here in the United States Senate now, is climate change and what's happening with our climate, not only in our country, but around the world. And what's interesting is, being from Alaska, we're at ground zero. Absolutely. I mean, we are the place where we see it, we feel it, and we have both ends of it. You know, we have both the oil and gas industry, but we also have the other end of it where we're seeing the results. So we're in a very unique situation, and I don't know what First Alaskans Institute is doing in this regard, but I'd be very interested in kind of what efforts you're doing or what discussions you're having around the issue of climate change. It will be a hot topic here, I know, in Washington over the next 3 months or so. So maybe you could expand on that a little bit later. Sure.
So last year at one of the board strategy sessions, the board talked about the changing nature of things that are happening in Alaska. Not only was it the census and redistricting that's coming, but also the energy crisis and climate change, and how those three things kind of working together are shaping the political voice of Alaska Natives within the state of Alaska. As a component of that study, we've started to research the climate change issue. Now, as you know, things are very complicated and unique at home.
Yes, they are.
And so we have a vast array of organizations within the Native community, and some of them are very geared towards the study of climate change or the issues that happen to Arctic people. And for the time being right now, First Alaskans is really looking at that whole scope.
Kind of the broad picture
Yeah,
first.
the broad picture. Where are our Native people on all of these issues, the diversity of those voices, and trying to figure out how can we shape policy that is helpful and works with the Alaska Native people. How do we find a way to create something that's usable by all of these organizations who are already doing the work and who are already providing forums for the Native people to have a voice.
You know, as the chairman of the board, Willie, how did the board, I mean, this is, you know, an interesting discussion point. I know for us back here in Washington that deal with climate change, energy, and all these issues, for us just to figure out what one we're going to deal with today is always difficult. But how did the board decide that these are 2 or 3 issues that we're going to deal with in climate change, energy, are going to be part of the equation? What
Yes.
drove the board kind of that discussion?
Well, the reality is that many of our people, many of our villages, most of our villages are still sort of involved from the standpoint of their livelihood. That is, I mean, we're still sort of connected to the mammals and
To
the
the land.
birds and to the seafood. And so from that standpoint, you know, we're concerned about the future and whether there'll be any impact on those sources of sustenance that our people have been connected to for literally millennia. And then at the same time, of course, we have communities that are right there on the coast, you know, along the rivers that are being impacted, you know, by the changing climate, the lack of ice, you know, the erosion that's taking place. And also, in terms of the future, you know, if in fact there is a continuation of the lengthening of the transport season through those waters, then people are concerned, you know, will there be a way for people who actually live in the Arctic areas to have some seat at the table to help think through some of the issues, you know, whether there's huge construction that might take place of harbors, whether there'll be you know, what happens when there's a zillion tourists that walk off a ship from Germany.
Right. Which is really
you know,
a real possibility.
Yeah, and
real.
so there are impacts that are likely to take place, and so we are very interested in having the communities, the boroughs, and the towns have some way to participate in the thinking that relates to developments in the Arctic.
This is, I guess, one of the important parts of the Institute is that it's not about just tomorrow, it's about the future.
Yes.
And this issue is not something that's, you know, next year something dramatically is going to happen, but it's really about how do you set the stage for the next generation to move through whatever those challenges might be. And that's kind of what I always sense from the Institute. It's not about just the moment, it's about long-term, generational impact.
That's right.
Through your leadership training that you're doing through this issue. Is that a fair statement? Is that?
Very fair.
Yeah.
In fact, that's the mission
Is that
of
the
the
mission?
Institute.
I didn't read the
Progress
mission.
for the next 10,000 years.
So that's, I mean, because I think about it, and you know, it's hard for people on the climate change issue to fully grasp what it may mean. But I think the lesson I learned when I was mayor was I went to a couple conferences and many elders were there. It was interesting listening. There were scientists and elders. And the combination was an interesting combination. The scientists who are now making comments about the discovery of what's happening in the Arctic, then the elders who made it very clear that they already knew this. And that I thought was very powerful. In a lot of ways, it sounds like what you're doing is taking that and saying, we're going to step up to the plate now and see what we can do to all the pieces that are out there, make sure we're doing it in the right direction.
Well, this is, I mean, this is a homeland, and people sometimes forget that we've been in that area for at least 10,000 years.
That's right.
And there's a great deal of knowledge inherent in the people. And I think back at, back in the Carter administration when they decided that the whales were disappearing.
Right.
When they stopped, you know, the whaling there for a
that's
spell.
right.
Well, the people knew that there were more whales, and we fought to ensure that they had an opportunity to be at the table, and actually in time began to work with the scientists, and in fact there were more whales.
That's right.
you know, and so they worked out an accommodation that allowed people to continue their way of life. And so I think our people do have respect for science, but at the same time, they like to kind of have their say about what they know.
That's right, which is a powerful, I mean, I can't tell you enough. When I was mayor and I heard from the elders and watching the scientists, you can watch the folks who have been studying it in essence for a few years, hearing the elders, and the response was, well, there's more information here than we had before.
Yes.
And the example you just gave on whaling is an important part of that equation. Let me ask you, if I can, I know you're working also in the area of education, and the Education Summit, which is until 2011, I think. Tell me a little bit about that, Liz, and what that means, what your goal is there.
So a few years back, First Alaskans actually convened a couple of education summits, and it was intended to bring Alaska Native teachers and families and parents and school boards, all the people who were involved in shaping the education of Native students in Alaska, together to talk about, you know, what are we doing and what direction are we going and where's the community and what can be done to ensure that Alaska Natives are getting great education, we're graduating, we're going through college, all of these kind of big questions. And that was the intent. The intent was to bring them together so that there could be some direction in terms of the Alaska Native education.
In 2011 is kind of make the next step to that? Is that kind of the goal?
The goal is to have another education summit in 2011. And the idea here is using some of the methods that First Alaskans has in hosting conversations that matter, is bringing...
I like that phrase, hosting conversations that matter.
Yes.
We need more of that in Washington, D.C. I might use that phrase. I didn't mean to sidetrack you there, but I might use that phrase.
And you know what, really, it's really about empowering every single person who comes, every single participant who sits in a chair, to have a voice in the construction of what that meeting is all about. And for us in Alaska, we know that one of the major issues is education.
That's right.
And how can we collectively come up with a solution to change the course of where we are? That's what the summit's for.
Is the thought, and again, Willie or Liz, either one of you can respond to this, is the thought, I mean, what's developed over education over the last 20, 30 years has changed dramatically. I mean, I have a personal view on No Child Left Behind. I think it's done damage to rural Alaska in a negative way. It hasn't really recognized the uniqueness of what the challenges are there, and you know, teaching in different subject matters, as well as it's more of a penalty program versus an incentive program. But putting that aside, I mean, Head Start, which is always underfunded, but an incredibly successful program. When I see kids that have had Head Start and then they move into the next grade levels, there's an example. My son who went to Montessori early education, and it seems like there can be so much more that we could be doing, both in the federal end but state end, in a combination. And as part of the goal that after you do the summit is, here's some target areas that we believe will improve education for rural Alaska and have kids more successful in whatever field or education or job. Willie, do you have any?
Well, of course, there's been just remarkable changes, you know, in my own lifetime. I mean, you know, we went to school in a small log cabin with just these hard desks, you know, and we weren't allowed to take any books home, you know, and it was, of course, before the telephone era, before TV, and before radio. Anyway,
you're dating yourself.
Yeah, I know.
But what we have to say to Alaskans,
that's right.
Alaskans understand this, but for outside the lower 48, that's really only the 1950s.
That's right.
You know, this is recent time.
This wasn't the turn of the century.
Right. This is really recent time.
But you know, education has always been, I think, an important factor. I mean, even in my grandfather's time, I didn't realize that he was one of the first generation to learn to write English. He had a pen pal I didn't know about back in 1915 in Elkhart, Indiana, a lady by the name of Isabel Reed, and I found some letters that he had written. I didn't even know he could read and write. So we've had, you know, a great interest in Western education and technology over time, but in a way, you know, that early education system really repressed our language, our culture, our knowledge that we had accumulated over a long period of time. And so, you know, trying to find room for ourselves in the classroom has been a real challenge. And while at the same time trying to educate our young people for a competitive world, you know, and I think we have made great strides, But you know, nothing stays the same, and there's real challenges ahead. And
we're in a global economy now.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's the difference from 10 years ago, let alone 20.
And I have to make a plug for my wife's Best Beginnings program, because you know it is an early learning program.
My wife is very familiar with it too.
For just we have to start with the absolute youngest,
that's
know, and nurture them, you know, through their academic career. And I think that's what we're going to try to explore with our next summit. I think there might be a request even to the Congress here for a little support for that.
Well, I'll tell you, this is, well, I will tell you that the early education I'm a big fan of. There's no question. I mean, as you said, Abby, my wife, Deborah, we've been engaged in this effort. It's a real plus. We know for every dollar you spend in early education, the return is 7+.
Yes.
And we know the impact. In rural Alaska, you can talk to teachers, as you know better than I do. They will tell you, we know the kids who have had early education. We know what they're going to be in successful levels as they move through the next education level. So that's very exciting.
Instilling that curiosity, I think, is so important.
That's right.
You know, and helping fulfill it. I think that's really what helped me, you know, in my youth, is I learned to read.
Right.
You know, even though we couldn't take books home from school.
Right. But it gave you that ability. I mean, you're I like to say renowned author, and a great book, which I've shared with some of my colleagues down here.
Well, thank you.
No, I think it's an important aspect. We have about a minute and a half left. If you guys got about 30 seconds you want to say about the Institute that you want to make sure you leave our viewers left with before I close it out.
Well, I think that I think it's really important for people to understand that First Alaskans Institute is it's a Native nonprofit, and it's statewide. And while we study, you know, issues like climate change and energy and census, what we're mainly concerned about are Alaska Natives and our progress for the next 10,000 years, as we said. But how do we get there? And how do we bring Alaska Natives to the table? So not only are they making the decisions, but they're helping to influence that policy about how we get there.
Creating the future leaders. That's very good.
The other part of it is, you know, we're an integral part of the economy now that we didn't used to be, you know, as a consequence of the Settlement Act. And so our success really is Alaska's success, and we'd like to point that out.
Well, I'll tell you, you both have been great guests here, and I want to thank you. We are out of time. These times go by very quick for Alaska Report. Again, I'd like to thank Willie Hensley and Liz Medicine Crow, both with the First Alaska Institute, for joining me today. And thanks for watching the Alaska Report. We'll see you next time as we continue our discussion about programs, policies, and projects that help and work for Alaskans. Have a great day.